Good morning. It is Friday, July 9th, and I'm in the home of Martha and
Gary.
Martha and Gary Braunings.
Right.
And it is my pleasure to be interviewing them today. Martha and Gary are dairy farmers, have been dairy farmers for a long time, and we're in Finksburg, Maryland. Gary, dairy farming's been in your family for a long time, hasn't it?
Yes, since I was about 7 years old.
Okay. Can you tell us about, first of all, let's start with when and where you were born.
Well, I was born on the northwest corner of 91 and Deer Park Road, in a house which my father had built when he got married in 1928 by grandparents and great uncles of Robin Ford, whose family name at that time was Barnes. And they built the house for him. I still have the deed, not the deed, but the bill of sale that Mr. Barnes wrote up for him when he built that house up on the crossroads. It's essentially the same. It's a 3-bedroom house. They built it for $483. I got the receipt upstairs.
And the house is still standing?
The house is still standing in good shape. And they had a clause in there that if there were any additions resulting in more expense, they had Mr. Bill Osterhuis and Mr. Worth Barnes listed as mediators. They would decide what the increase in price would be. My father, Mr. Harson, and the builder, Mr. Barnes, agreed to that, and that's the way they did things then.
You're right.
But they didn't have any additions, so they settled at that price.
Amazing. Now, you were born in what year again?
1929.
1929. And when you were 7 years old, your family bought the land down here?
No. When I was 7 years old, my father sold the house on the crossroads at a profit.
Okay.
And the house had been built on a 7-acre tract that his mother bought when her husband died, who had been a farmer. And she was raising 5 girls and my father out of a family of 11 children, the others having been older and gotten away. But they lived there on that 7-acre place and grew vegetables and chickens and like that. And when he got married, he built a house on one corner of the 7 acres.
I see. And
that 7 acres was our first farm. He had a old schoolhouse moved from where his father-in-law had farmed down on Deer Park Road, and we built a barn out of it.
Okay.
And had 2 horses and 4 cows, and we milked those cows by hand and used the horses to plow and hare and like that. And then he wanted to be a farmer, but he was working at a Congoian Nairn after he became 16, and he saved a little money, and he wanted to buy a farm. And this farm across the road, which is the homestead for Brownside Farms, was a 101-acre tract that was up for county taxes, owned by absentee landowners in Baltimore City. And one day he asked Mr. Cunningham, who was the vice president and the main man up at Carroll County Bank, if they had any land available in this area. Mr. Cunningham told my father, he took me along. I was just a little boy, but I was interested, and he took me along. Mr. Cunningham says, "Horace, if you want this property," he says, "you owe $1,000 back taxes, and you owe the Carroll County Bank $1. And for $1,001, the farm's yours." So my father agreed, and we came back home and asked Mr. Osterhuis, who owned the farm up here on the crossroads, if it was a good buy or not, because he was renting the place at that time from the county and farming it. And he says, "Yes, Horace, go ahead and buy it." So that's how we got the place. No buildings on it. And some pretty bad gutters, but it was a farm anyway.
Sure. And so you started farming on that property over time. Now, how did that go? Tell me about how you developed it into the dairy farm that it is today.
Well, first we bought 2 horses at a sale in Baltimore City. They had been, obviously, from what we learned later, they had been in a stable fire. They had been creaming horses. We named them Pet and Bill, and we used the old schoolhouse that my grandfather got by default when the county closed the school on his property down here on Deer Park Road, and we built. Actually, it was a garage, which later held. We put 2 cars and 2 tractors in it. But at that time, we used it. We tied the horses up at one end, and down both sides, we tied our cows up. And we didn't have a barn, but my grandfather Leicester, he helped my father and other people around, and they planted posts 10 foot on the square, about 30 by 30, and then the fodder that we grew and the stubble and the straw from the wheat crop the first year, we put on top of this network of posts, and that was the roof.
Right.
The cover all for the cattle and the horses to stay warm. That lasted about 3 years till we got enough money to build the barn.
So you made do.
Made do. We went a little bit at a time like that all through life.
Now that's the way it was. You'd save up until you could afford to buy something. You'd do one phase, and then you move into the next phase. Now you were doing everything by horsepower then, I take it.
Yes,
No tractors.
we had 2 horses, and we always borrowed horses from Mr. Bill Oysterhoose, brother-in-law. Then he had a brother on the old Browning home place over here at Louisville. He'd send one of us boys, my brother Bud, up to Oysterhoose's, send me over to Braunings. They'd lend me the worst horse they had that they wasn't using. Bud would get old Bobby. He was a blind horse.
Oh no!
He was blind, but you'd put him on the offside, and he'd work just perfect.
He'd pull.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
And that's how we got things done.
No kidding. That's amazing. What a great story.
One little side story is about that. My brother Bud, he never walked behind a hare. He was too young, and so we always let him ride. He rode the lead horse, old Pet.
Oh, no kidding.
And he was herring one day a strip from the Deer Park Road back east to the end of the farm. And my father told him, now don't turn too short, Bud, because you don't want your horses to step in the hare. Well, his horses was turning too short, so he stopped them. And he sat there, and the horse sat down. And he sat there and was holding on to the hames, afraid to fall off, afraid to get off, afraid to do anything. Mr. Fred Muse, a neighbor down the road, he happened to be out there working in the garden, and he heard Bud holler. And he walked up there, and he said he looked a little serious, but he had to laugh, because he said the old horse knew more than the boy. And he walked over and got a hold of the horse and straightened her up, and they went on to herring. But that's the first thing that ever happened was between us boys. And we always laughed at Bud because he was sitting on there, and he was afraid to fall off, he was afraid to get off, and he didn't know what to do.
Now, the horse just decided, I'm tired, and sat down.
Turned too short, and just as soon as the horse stepped on the trace, he sat down like a dog, you know.
Yeah. And the boy's hanging on for dear life.
Yeah.
Now, how old was he then, do you think?
He was about 8, not over that.
No kidding.
He was 8, and I'd have been 9.
See, at that time, young boys and girls learned early. I mean, they took a lot of responsibility very early in life to do things around the farm. I mean, as soon as you were big enough to get on a horse, you were on the horse. Yeah, and you were working.
My grandfather told him how to hare the field, and he was doing it. He just had a little trouble, that's all.
What a funny story. That is so neat. Wow. But everything turned out okay in the end.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So you eventually got your barn. Tell me about getting the barn built.
Well, the barn was built by a man by the name of Mr. Belt from over at near Hampstead.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather and my father and a couple neighbors sawed the timber out of our woods, which is Red Oak Hills now.
Mm-hmm.
And they sawed it to the specifications of Mr. Belt. He had a plan to build a barn. He built all his barns the same way. Had a Western style roof instead of just a straight 45-degree roof. He had a bend in the roof.
Mm-hmm.
He laid the framework out with the tape measures and pegs near where the barn was to be built. And he had the whole plan right there on the ground, and we had the logs sawed to size, and we hauled them up with horses and laid them on the plan that he had made.
Mm-hmm.
And the guys took the drill and drilled. Everything was pegged. There wasn't no nails in the frame.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And they drilled the holes, and they all had to be right. They didn't put them together. They only laid them out the way the plan was. And when we raised the barn, everything fit exactly. It's still there.
Mm-hmm.
And the neighbors all came in when they raised the barn, maybe about 15 or 20 neighbors, and nobody just expected any money.
Mm-hmm.
But my mother kept everybody in lemonade and iced tea.
Right.
It didn't suit a lot of them. They'd rather had beer, but they wasn't going to get any beer because they wouldn't have been able to work right.
That's right.
So she brought an old car down, and at noon, my father says, "Come on, Gary, you want to go along?" So I went along with him. We went out to the store, and there's two stores in Gamber.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Ed Bonner had the upper store, and Mr. Clint Shipley had the lower store.
Mm-hmm.
We went to Ed Bonner's, and he bought all the packaged cigarettes that he had.
Okay.
And we went down to Mr. Clint, and Mr. Clint wouldn't sell quite all of them because
Right.
he wanted to keep a couple packs.
Sure.
We brought all the cigarettes down in a half a bushel basket, and everybody lined up, all the workers lined up to come through, and they each got 2 or 3 packs.
Mm-hmm.
Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields or well, I can't remember, but
So that's how they got paid.
yeah, they took that, and it was the thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody complained, and tobacco usage was a great thing then.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't seem to harm anybody. We was too damn dumb to know that it was harmful. So everybody smoked.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't let me have any.
Well, you were all, what, 7 or 8 years old?
Yeah.
Well, you didn't need any of that. That's really interesting. So all the neighbors came together and helped out.
Yep.
And got paid in cigarettes.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned that they put the frame together with pegs. Wooden pegs.
Wooden pegs.
Yeah. And so there's no nails in the framework at all. When they put it up, it's all just pegged together.
That's right.
And makes it more solid. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they saved the nails for, I guess, the outside.
Well, the roofing and the sheathing
Right.
was all nailed properly.
And it's still there.
Yeah, it's in good shape too.
Wow. That's just amazing. Fascinating.
That's the way most all the barns around were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, Mrs. Browning, why don't you tell me about where were you born and when were you born?
I was born in 1930
Okay.
on Hucksville Road,
Uh-huh.
and the house where my father was raised
No
had
kidding.
been in the family for years.
And that's in what town?
Hampstead,
In
near
Hampstead.
Hampstead,
Okay.
on Hucksville Road.
Mm-hmm.
And we were farmers, and my grandfather before him were farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So we were all, so when I married Gary, I knew a lot about farming.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
I always said that I couldn't complain about a farmer's life because I knew what I was getting into.
Absolutely. So you grew up on a farm.
Yes.
So as a little girl, what kind of chores did you have?
What kind of what?
Chores. What kind of things did you?
Well, as I said, my brother that was 13 died when he was 13, and he was the one that was going to be the farmer.
Mm-hmm.
So my sister was allergic to hay and dust, so she couldn't go in the barn,
Right.
but I could.
Okay.
And I remember particularly when I guess I became an adolescent, and my father said, help your mother clear the table with the dishes. I said, I don't have to do that. I milk cows and I work in the field. He said, you get up and clear the table, Martha, and I got up and cleared the table.
Of course you did. But so you did the inside work and the outside work.
I did both,
Yeah, so you
well,
might-
not when I was real small, but
Right.
as soon as I was big enough to get around, real good.
So you milk cows and
Yeah, he put me on a tractor real young.
no kidding.
Yeah.
So you were driving a tractor as a little girl.
Yeah,
You
when I
were-
was 10, 12, something like
Well,
that.
that's a little girl. You were a tomboy then.
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. So you had all the chores of. Yeah. I don't. Kids today wouldn't have any idea of how to work like that. That's amazing.
Well, it was just expected.
Sure.
I mean, farming's different from any other occupation. You've derived your whole livelihood from the farm,
Yes.
and everybody had to help produce in one way or another.
Everybody in the family did what they could to help out.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
It was just understood, and
Sure.
I had good parents and never questioned that I shouldn't work, and all the neighbor kids were the same way.
Mm-hmm. Now, besides cows, you said you milk cows. So was it a dairy farm?
Yes, it was a dairy farm.
How many cows did you have?
We milked about 20 when we were milking by hand.
That's a lot.
And then when they got the milkers, we started milking more.
Mm-hmm.
But we were just a small dairy farm.
Mm-hmm. But you also had a truck garden.
Oh, yeah.
You
And we had all kinds of crops,
Mhm.
just like Gary did.
Mm-hmm. And so you would put up things. You do your canning and
Yes.
save as much as you could for the house for the winters.
And before we had freezers, we canned everything and
Mhm.
smoked the meat to keep
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
But once freezers came in, then we switched over to freezers.
Sure, it made it a lot easier. Yeah. Now, you didn't have a refrigerator? Did you have an ice box in your house?
I can remember vaguely
Yeah.
bringing the ice in.
Right, to keep things cool.
No.
Yeah. What did you do for entertainment? What kind of?
Okay, well, we had neighbors, and of course the church was our social function.
Mm-hmm.
So we were all in Sunday school together,
Mm-hmm.
and we all got together and played. And we played ball in the yard every evening after we finished our chores. And my mother wouldn't let me. Sometimes I didn't have to help do the dishes. She'd let me go, so that I could go with the neighbors. We played ball with the neighbors, but then the neighbors would come. And we were lucky on our farm. We had a cement walk from the kitchen to the barn,
Okay.
and they were good ways apart.
Mm-hmm.
And we got roller skates with keys, and the kids used to come. And if we didn't have enough skates, we would share with each other,
Mm-hmm.
and we skated, and that's how we learned to skate. So we were popular with skates.
I bet you were. You probably had all the neighbor kids coming around to skate.
Well, it was mainly the girls that
Yeah.
I was friendly with.
Yeah.
I don't remember any boys coming to
Oh,
skate,
okay.
but the
Yeah.
girls did.
Great. And what other games did you play?
Oh, well, we took walks. After we finished our chores, they would let us walk places and go together and do things, you know. And we would go. We had a swimming hole where we would swim.
Okay, so Mr. Browning, tell me about how you established your dairy farm. After you guys got your barn, you had a few cows, but you brought it up to a pretty good-sized dairy, didn't you?
Yeah, at first there was a company in Hanover that came around once a week and collected cream.
Mm-hmm.
So until we got 7 cows, we milked by hand, and we carried the milk from the barn up to the house, and in the basement we had a separator,
Mm-hmm.
and we stored our cream there, and it didn't matter whether it was fresh or sour,
Mm-hmm.
because we never put any ice with it or cooled it,
Right.
but they collected it once a week.
Mm-hmm.
But then after we got 7 cows, we started shipping milk to Kuntz's Creamery in Westminster.
Mm-hmm.
And those 7 cows, like I say, we didn't make much money for a while, because now the first month, I remember, we had to buy a strainer and 2 milk cans and soap powder and 2 buckets. And I was a freshman in high school then, so I'd ride with the milkman from here to Westminster and help him throw the cans up in the truck.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to Kuntz's Creamery. I'd walk across the field to Westminster High School, right straight across. And I got the check. The first check I got was $5. I think it was $5.62, and it wasn't in my name, but they gave a check to me because they knew it was where it belonged.
Your first check for milk?
Was $5 for a month.
For a month?
From Mr. Wentz, the manager up there in the Kuntz's plant. It's $5.62 because we had to pay. It's different then. You didn't pay 2 cents on a $1,000 bill. You paid for whatever the cost was,
right,
till you got it paid off. And then, if you got any money left over, you got it.
Exactly.
And that's if people would still be doing that, there wouldn't be any houses up for sale in the paper.
You're probably right about that. Tell me about what for the people that are listening to this and watching this video. Explain what a separator is, because I know a lot of people don't know what that was.
The separator worked on the same principle as a centrifuge. You poured the milk in a vat, and the vat had a paddle in there, and it spun around and stirred the milk up. Then you stopped the paddle, and the whole vat spun around, and the cream was lighter than the milk,
right,
and the cream went to the outside edge and up, and it went through holes in the outside of the separator, so you could take all the cream out of the milk by running the separator for a while.
So you have the cream separated from the rest of the regular milk, the whole milk.
That's one way they did it. Another way they did it was pour your milk in a container, and the next morning the cream would be on top.
It would flow to the top.
And you run all the milk out the bottom shuttle, and we feed hogs with that. And the cream, you run in a can and save that for the creamer.
Right. People, anybody that had a dairy farm had a separator for the most part.
Yep.
Yeah, and they would use that every day to separate their milk. People listening to this or watching this would not know that under normal circumstances, but in the old days, everybody had a separator. Right. And you cranked it by hand.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's when we were up there. We cranked it by hand, but down here we had an electric socket, and I don't know what year it was when we built that house there, but a fellow from Patapsco was a beginning electrician. There weren't any electricians around because there wasn't any electricity in the rural area, but he was a beginning electrician. He worked at the plant. He wired a barn and wired a house. And I remember the first time my mother said, "Faye, turn the switch on for the lights in the kitchen." The first morning we lived down there, she turned the kitchen switch on, the light went on in the barn, and there wasn't no light in the house at all. And that's was normal. The electricians weren't practiced enough. They hadn't done enough to know exactly what they were doing.
Right.
But we got it straightened out.
I'm sure. That's a funny story.
Yeah, turn the light on, turn the switch on, light went on down in the barn.
Well, Mr. Browning, you said that you went to Westminster High School, and
yes.
Where did you go for grade school?
Mechanicsville Elementary.
Okay, so
that building is still standing in Gamber.
Okay.
It's apartments now, but it had been a 10th grade public school, and when I was in the 2nd grade, they consolidated all the rural, not all the rural high school students, but most of them, where they could get a bus and a driver. They hauled the students to a central location. Westminster was the central location for this area, and those in the 10th grade went there. But the first year, and then the second year, 9th and 10th went. And then the 3rd year, 8, 9, and 10, and I think they added an 11th grade too.
Right.
Well, but they kept 7 grades, and that was the standard elementary school in Gamber.
Right.
and we graduated from the 7th grade.
Mm-hmm.
It was different then. Boys had, very few boys graduated from the 7th grade at 12 or 13 years old. Most of them 14, 15, almost 16, because they'd stay home most of the year and work on the farm.
Right.
When I graduated from 7th grade, 9 boys in the class, 13 girls. Out of the 9 boys, 7 of them went in the armed services within 2 months after we graduated from 7th grade. A couple of them were 16,
right.
The rest of them were 15,
okay.
and their recruiters had them sign a waiver. They'd go in, but they wouldn't put them on active duty or send them anywhere under fire until they were 16 or 17.
No kidding. Now, what year was that? Do you recall? When you got out of 7th grade?
It must have been, well, I was 12 years old and I was born in 29, so it must have been 42.
So we were in World War II at the time.
Yeah, World War
so they
II
really
just
needed
started.
soldiers.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting. Because of the agriculture and because of the work that the young boys had to do, a lot of the times, I guess they wouldn't necessarily get held back. They just didn't have a chance to get all their
That's
learning
right,
in.
and they didn't. They weren't dumb.
No.
They were all smart.
Sure.
But they were big and strong, and
they just didn't get their time in. They
right.
were so busy doing the farm work that they didn't get all their
right.
education in until they were a little bit older.
Right.
Now, did a lot of the kids make it all the way through school? Now, did they have 12 grades then, or did they stop?
No, they only had 11.
They stopped at 11.
Yeah.
At that time. Did
They stopped at 10 the first couple of years I went to school, and then because that was all there when they graduated from Mechanicsville. Before they had buses to take them to Westminster.
Right.
They graduated and got a diploma 10 years, and then they went to 11 in Westminster.
Okay.
Now it's 12.
Yeah. Now, when you were going to Westminster, you went through the 11th grade then?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what year did you graduate?
I graduated in 47.
Okay. And so a lot of the kids would go as far as the 7th grade, and that would be the end of it for
That's
them?
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that was a good, solid education for them. I mean, they'd have their English and their math and whatever they did
Yes.
on the farm. You know, people don't realize how much education some of those children got. If you get an old school book from those old days, like an old arithmetic book or a math book, you find that it's got algebra and trigonometry in it. I mean, it's amazing how it's got college level stuff in there that they were learning in the 6th and 7th grade, because they really, I mean, you had to know a lot on the farm. The guys that were building those barns,
That's right.
knew a whole lot about angles and putting things together. A lot of math.
That's right. My father, he knew. Lyman Earhart was the math teacher in Westminster, and he made sure everybody in his A class had to have slide rules. Well, when I got a slide rule and learned how to use it, I thought I was something. My father one day down there, he taught me more about a slide rule in 5 minutes than I was able to learn from Mr. Earhart in a year. I mean, those guys knew what they were doing.
No.
When we thrashed in the evenings, once in a while, we'd have a spelling bee. Old men,
Right.
and everybody would get in the spelling bee. And my mother, she only went to 6th grade, or George Shipley, the guy when he went to the 2nd grade, they'd always win the spelling bee. They'd always win. They'd beat my sister. She was a year older than me. And Gene Fields from up the road here, he was an airline pilot when he graduated from college. So the kids that competed weren't dumb, but the old guys were smarter.
And that was a form of entertainment, to use your brain and to practice your knowledge in a contest,
Right.
like a spelling bee. You don't ever see anybody doing that anymore today. But that was a way for the older people to train the younger people.
That's right.
And show them how valuable it was to be intelligent. Very interesting. How about you, Mrs. Browning? Where did you go to grade school?
I went to Hampstead Elementary when I went to school. It started the 1st grade through the 11th, so I was in the same school My whole school year.
You were in the same school all 11 years, and that's as far as it went.
Right.
Now, were you in the same class with the same group of students from first grade through 11th grade? Did you have some of the
Until
same
we had to
classmates?
decide on our majors,
Mm-hmm.
and then we had commercial, general, and academic.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were a tight-knit group.
I bet, yeah. So it was children from around the area that started in the first grade together, and they were your classmates pretty much through your whole education career.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How interesting. So that you made some really close friends. Do you still have some of those friends? Do you still
Oh, yes. And we still get a reunion every year.
Do you really?
But there were only 23 in our class. We only had 7 boys.
Yeah.
So we didn't have anybody to date hardly.
Oh. Now, when you graduated from what school?
Hampstead.
Hampstead School. Where did you go after that?
Then I went to Western Maryland College.
Okay.
I was a day hop for 3 years, and then my last year I lived on campus.
Okay.
And I majored in biology and phys ed,
Mm-hmm.
and then they needed teachers real bad when I graduated in 1951.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew Mr. Jennis well, and he said, Martha, I'm just going to send you right back to Hampstead where you went to school, because he knew I could ride with my sister to school, because she was working in the bank. She was older than me, so I rode to school with her. Always had a way back and forth. So, but it was pretty difficult to go back and teach with the teachers that had taught you.
Sure.
And as soon as I came in, they said, now, Martha, we want you to call us by our first name.
Right.
And my second grade teacher was can't remember, Miss Sturr. And I was supposed to call her by her first name, and my principal was Bertie Houck, and Bertie says, now call me Bertie. And I was like, ooh. Yeah. But I did it, and then I became very close to those teachers.
Sure. But it was odd because we were always taught as children that you show respect to your elders, to your teachers, and
right.
you would never call them, you would never think to call them by their first name.
Never.
In a lot of cases, you wouldn't even know what their first name was. It was just Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith or whatever. Yeah.
I remember Gladys Miller. She had taught first grade there for years, and she advised me. She said, now, Martha, if you have a student that's misbehaving, she said, you at that time you could shake them, or you could send them to the principal. Right. She said, but I'm telling you right now, if you shake a child, you make sure you know who you're shaking. Because some parents will reinforce you, and others will cause trouble.
Yes.
And she had found that out in her career.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's right.
Yeah.
Entirely different. Now, I taught just 2 years, and then we had our first child, and then the next year we had another one. And but it was different then. It was entirely different.
Now,
I did a lot of substituting over the years.
What year did you graduate from Western Maryland?
1951.
1951. Now, how did you and Mr. Browning meet?
Oh, well, that's unique. I had a brother that was dying of Bright's disease. He had real bad kidney trouble. He had been born with it as a little boy, and that's why he could never farm. He didn't have the strength. And he was dying that year, my senior year. It was in November. It was getting close to Christmas. He was married and had a wife and 3 little children. And I didn't have a date for one of the dances. And my roommate, Janet Herring, she was very popular. She had lots of boyfriends. And she said, you're not going to sit in this dorm room when I'm going to the dance. You're going to go too, and I'm going to call up Gary Brauning and ask him to take you. Well, I said, I don't really want you to do that. I don't think I want to go with a farmer. She said, well, I'm going to call him up. So she called him up. And she told me later, after I married him, she had a terrible time talking him into it because he didn't know what he was getting into. But he showed up. I said, now, they'll call on the intercom then. You had to stay up in your room, and they'd call and announce down the hall that Martha Bookman has a visitor. And so they never called my name, that I had a visitor. And I guess what happened, there were so many calling that they missed his call. And so I'm sitting upstairs in my room waiting for the call, and he's sitting down in the waiting room waiting for me. And finally I went down, and he was the only one left.
No kidding. So
we went on our blind date, and then that was the beginning of everything.
Well, Mr. Browning, she was worth the wait, wasn't she?
Yep.
Absolutely. So you went to a dance, at Western Maryland College. And what kind of a band did they have there? I guess they had a band.
They had a band, but we weren't very good dancers.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to dance very well, neither did he. And I remember he said a calf or something and kicked him in his leg, and his leg hurt, so we just kind of danced around a little bit.
Yeah.
But we weren't accomplished dancers.
You had a good time, though.
But he was active in 4-H, and I was in 4-H, and so that was a good subject for us to talk about.
Absolutely. And how long have you been married?
57 years.
Well, see, it worked. That's great. That's
We have 4 children,
wonderful.
all married, and all live on part of the farm.
Amazing. Now, Mr. Browning, well, I started asking you about the dairy farm, and we got sidetracked. You started off with, you said 7 cows, but
7 cows milked by hand.
milk by hand.
And then when we got the barn down here built, it was during the war, and you had trouble getting any kind of equipment, but they allowed the county agriculture advisory board allowed us 10 stanchions. So we got 10 stanchions from Montgomery Ward, and we put them in. Mike Barnes helped us put them in, and then we bought 5 cows from a man by the name of Johnson down in Green Spring Valley. So then we had 12, but a couple of them was dry all the time. So we put those 10 stanchions in, and we still milked by hand for about 2 years, and then we were allowed. We were shipping enough milk. Then we became eligible for milking machines. So the county agent and that group of advisors allocated us 2 surge milking units. We didn't know anything about them, but there was a good many people around here then that had moved up here to enroll in the war effort. They came from the south and the mountainous regions, and they were good workers. And this one guy by the name of Shane, he had experience with a dairy farm, and he lived over the hill here, and my father got him to come over and show us how to demonstrate. He demonstrated how to put the milkers on. He only had ever put milkers on from the right side of the cows, where people had sat on stools and milk.
Right.
So I didn't know that you should train your cows, put milkers on from both sides, because then you could milk 2 cows without moving the machine from the petcock stall.
Right.
And I didn't know that for a couple of years, and so somebody came in the barn one day and laughed at me, and they said, "Well, you're doing it. You're getting the milk all right, but you're working twice as hard as you have to." And by that time, if you milked the wrong side, the cow wasn't used to it, and she'd kick you.
Sure.
So I only tried it once or twice, and I quit it.
Yeah.
But then when my boys started milking, well, they knew it was wrong, and they started doing it the proper way. A lot of things like that in my lifetime. Tractors. For a while, people didn't realize that you had to drain the water out of a tractor and put antifreeze in it. At the least little cold spell, they'd freeze up and you'd be in trouble.
Sure.
Well, that was just one thing, but there was a lot of things like that people didn't know about. We were constantly making the transition from horse equipment to mobilized equipment where a tractor would pull the machine. So you'd cut the horse tongues off, make a stub tongue out of them, or you'd put the machine up on blocks and build some kind of a hitch underneath of it. So those kind of things people were doing all the time.
Sure.
And I remember every child on a farm, I'll say every child, pretty well every man child was interested in driving a tractor. Little kids had their toys, they wanted to drive a tractor.
Absolutely.
Well, my brother Dave, he ran for county commissioner last year, or a couple of years ago, so some people will know him. We were eating lunch down there one day. Dave was 4 years old, and he had ridden along on the tractor with my father, not with me, but with my father. He'd sat on the seat in front of my father, and he'd hold on to the steering wheel. We were eating lunch, and I had parked an Oliver 70 tractor out in a haired field 50 feet from the house. And I put it in first gear to keep it from drifting up or backwards.
Sure.
And turn the switch off. Dave got down from the table and went outside, and we figured he went out to play. But we heard the tractor start and move. Dave had gotten up on the seat, and he remembered you push this button and you push that button, and when he pushed that button, the tractor was still hot and started up.
It started right up, yeah.
And I realized that at once. I jumped up and ran out of the house, and I caught him just before he got up here to the state road. It was a dirt road then, but it was a high bank on this side.
Sure.
And he just sat on there like that and looked through the steering wheel, but he was going right straight. And so he learned how to drive a tractor before anybody ever taught him.
So he was 4 years old when
4 years old, yeah.
What a story.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Now, you mentioned earlier when we were speaking that a story about a fellow that was driving a tractor, I guess for the first time, and
That was Mr. Marsh Miller.
what happened?
Muller. Marsh Muller from over Salem Bottom. He had about 5 sons, and they were good and big truck farmers. But they made enough money, and they bought a Farmall B tractor to cultivate their crops, so they wouldn't have to do it with a horse and 3-legged plow.
Sure.
And Mr. Muller wouldn't run the tractor for a while, but then one day they had a whole lot of plowing to do, and he was tired, and at noon meal he told Bob and Henry, "I'm going out, boys, you can stay here a little while longer. I'm going out and plow the rest of that tomato patch." So he went out, and after a bit they heard somebody holler, "Whoa!" And Mr. Muller had gotten on the tractor and started her up, but when he got out to the field at Salem Bottom Road, to the bank,
Right.
he thought he was still driving horses, and he hollered, "Whoa," but the tractor wouldn't stop. He went right down over the bank, and when it went down over the bank, it stalled out.
Yeah.
It broke one shovel, that's all.
He was lucky.
But he was lucky he didn't get killed.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he hollered at the tractor to stop, and it wouldn't.
The daggone tractor wouldn't stop. He said, "Boys, what's the matter here?" He says, "I hollered, whoa, as loud as I could holler, and it still wouldn't stop." And they told him he realized then what he'd done wrong.
Oh goodness, what a funny story.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Browning, earlier you told me about your family used to have a Huckster Out. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. It was during the height of the Depression from 28 to 35, and 36 when we moved down here. But in the meantime, my father had an older sister. She and her husband had a Huckster Out in Baltimore City. And we had a neighbor that had a Huckster Out in Baltimore City. So my father was used to having gone along with them, so he knew the in and outs of a Huckster Out. And when we lived up on the crossroads, like I say, we had a large chicken house up, large for then. We had about 300 laying hens.
Wow.
And he started a Huckster Out in Baltimore City, selling eggs and chickens, dressed chickens, and whatever else we had. And a neighbor had a large garden, and he almost always had produce that he'd sell real cheap to my father, and we'd take that along down.
So a Huckster Route was where you would go down to Baltimore and do a route and sell
And
produce.
you'd build up a clientele. The way you did it, you'd rap on doors and ask people, "Miss Brown, would you care to buy a dressed chicken today? Or do you need any eggs? Do you need any strawberries? We have fresh strawberries." Well, and once in a while you'd get a customer, so when you got enough customers for the produce that you had, then you used that as your base.
Right.
And we'd go once a week. Some people went twice, but we went once a week. And our Huckster Out was always around the lake there, at Fruit Hill Park.
Okay.
And I remember, I guess I was 4, 5, 6, something like that. And my father used to let me take some of the deliveries up the stairs to the buyers. And this one day I took a dozen eggs to a lady, and she took them and she patted me on the shoulder and paid me. Next week we went around, and he sent me up that same place with whatever I had. And she said, "Son, go get your father." So I didn't know what was the matter. I went and had to go down the street a little ways and got my father. Sure. He came and we went up there. She had gone back in the house and she met him at the door. And she had a little saucer, a little cup, and she had a peepee in it, a dead peepee in it. And he wanted to know what happened. She wanted to know what happened.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well," when Mr. Horse looked at me, "What happened, boy?" Because we always had to wash the eggs off and put them in a clean container, you know.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, you know, what might have happened, Dad, was last week one day, Faye and I were gathering eggs, and we always competed to see who could gather the most eggs.
Right.
And I found a nest of eggs back under the boards where an old chicken must have been a-setting, and I put them eggs in my basket. I won the contest, but it wasn't the proper thing to do.
Those eggs were half frozen.
Yeah, they was all ready to hatch almost. She had a laugh, snicker a little bit.
Sure.
And if I'd have been 10 or 12 years old, they'd, you know, it'd have been different.
Sure.
But I wasn't even in school yet.
And you were in a contest. You told the truth.
Yeah.
And I guess you took your punishment because she got your father in there. And But you kept a customer.
And another funny thing that happened, people might be interested in. My father's oldest nephew was James Browning, and he always wanted to go along on Huckster Out. And he lived over the hill here about a mile where my father had been born. And one day, my father decided to let him go along. And I stayed home, and he took Jim. And Jim went along with him, and that day when we came back, we went over to Mr. Bill Oysterhuse's, took him some egg cartons and this, that, and the other. And Aunt Eunice, my father's sister, and Uncle Bill asked Jim, says, "Well, how'd you do today? What'd you learn, Jim?" Jim says, "Well," he says, "today I saw the ocean." He says, "It's the biggest body of water in the whole world, Atlantic Ocean." And he was talking about the lake there. And, he never said anything to my father, but almost all day they were riding around this whole lake delivering produce, you know. And old Jim says, "Well, today I saw the Atlantic Ocean," and he says, "It's the biggest and the prettiest body of water I've ever seen."
Now, how old was he?
Jim was about 12.
Oh, you had to laugh.
Yeah.
That's a great story. Now, you both told me that during World War II, you told me the other day we were saying about what it was like around here during World War II. Could you speak to that a little bit? There was rationing on the farms, so it made it a little tougher to get some things. What was it like?
Well, the labor part of it was probably the biggest handicap, because not all the good laborers, the strong-bodied men, were in the service, but most of them were either in the service or in a service-connected manner that they weren't available for farm labor. So we had kids, neighbor kids. We all picked tomatoes and picked up potatoes and that kind of stuff. But toward the end of the war, they had a German prisoner of war labor camp up on Griswold's farm near Westminster. And farmers in the county could utilize those prisoners of war on their farm as day laborers. You could get as many as 5 men at a time, and they always send it, not always, they send an armed guard along with a loaded rifle. And he set somewhere and watched them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after you had utilized these prisoners for a week or so, they became just like you. I mean, they most of them had said they didn't really want to join the German army. They were put in the army to fill the ranks, and most of them would say, first, we wouldn't surrender to an Italian. We didn't have to. And we wouldn't surrender to a British unless we thought we could trust him. But whenever we got close to an American unit, we was all on the same idea. We throw our hands up. And if they didn't shoot us, then they'd make us prisoners of war.
Right.
And when they questioned us, if they found out we had a country background, they sent us to America to be a prisoner of war and work on farms. I remember one year down here, there wasn't any mechanical machines to work with potatoes. But because potatoes were high priced and the German prisoners were available and we had all these neighbor kids, we planted 5 acres of potatoes, of cobblers by hand.
Right.
And this barn, this here homemade barn that we had down there to start with, we filled that up with potatoes.
Wow.
The whole blooming thing from ground to the roof. And the one man who worked for my father, Elping Dutterer from Westminster, he had contact with A&P Grocery Company. And they made a sale, and we supplied potatoes to the A&P stores from Reisterstown to Arlington in Baltimore with potatoes there for a while.
No kidding.
And that was, we got so daggone, us kids got so darn tired of washing potatoes and fooling with potatoes. We hated potatoes for 20 years, I guess.
My dad was a huckster too, and he told the story.
Yeah, tell them that.
They drove a team to Baltimore, and they stopped at the 5 Mile House and all that, and he said they'd have a lot of potatoes, and they'd stop at these houses, and sometimes they had to go up a couple steps, to get to anybody. He said, and we'd carry potatoes, and he'd go up and he'd say, "Now, what kind of potatoes do you want?" And she'd say, a certain kind. "Well, I got that." And he always had what they wanted because a lot of them didn't know the difference between the potatoes.
Right.
And whatever he had, but he said he wasn't going to carry bags up 3 flights of stairs and not have the right potatoes.
Sure. Wow. So he actually drove a team down towards Baltimore.
Yes, and he said, like I say, I lived on this dairy farm over in Houcksville, and his father was in the home place. And my father was the last of 8 children. And so he took the Huckster Out for his father. And he said when he'd be coming home on the pike over at Hampstead, his father would be out in the barn and he'd have a lantern and he'd have feed in the troughs and he could hear him coming on the pike.
Sure.
And his father would have everything ready to feed the horses and take care of them. They looked out for each other.
Yeah, they were glad to get home, I'll bet.
Right.
Yeah, so that was an all-day job then. The Huckster
Oh, they stayed
Out.
overnight. They would be gone a couple
would they?
days.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now they went down the Baltimore Pike. You mentioned 5 Mile House.
Yeah, wasn't that what it was,
They
Gary?
went down the road that goes through Hampstead Main Street to Reisterstown. They went down the Reisterstown Road.
Right.
At that time, the streetcar track's in the middle of the road, so they stayed on the right-hand side of the road. They had 2 lanes there they had to stay in, and they'd stop at the 10 Mile House if they were late getting started. That was on the north side of Reisterstown. 5 Mile House was about 3 miles north of Pikesville. They'd stop there if it was late in the evening, and then the next day they'd go to Baltimore.
Now, was this a place where they could stay over, like a
An inn.
Yeah.
The 5 and 10 Mile House were taverns.
Okay.
They had
Bedding, and they'd feed them there.
they had stables, and they had accommodations for sleeping and meals. and
They had to pay for that.
Yeah, they had to pay for it, but
Sure.
That
just
was
like
part of their expenses.
anybody else.
This is on the Baltimore Pike.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Reisterstown had streetcars?
Reisterstown had streetcars till I was about 7 or 8 years old.
No kidding.
Streetcars from Baltimore City came up through Pikesville and then up the Reisterstown Road, 2 lines in the center of the road, one north and one south. And they went all the way, they went to where the road turns off and go down to Glendon.
Right.
That's where the streetcar line stopped. At least that's as far as I ever went.
Right.
And then they supplanted the streetcars with the M bus.
Right.
When I went to Hopkins, you used the M bus, and it did the same thing as the streetcars. It turned around the same place, had the same schedule and all.
But in those days, you could actually get on a streetcar in Reisterstown and ride it all the way down to Baltimore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they had streetcars that went right on through Baltimore.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Of course, all that's gone. That was a different time.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's coming back.
I think you may be right.
We may have to.
Well, that might not be a bad thing.
No.
You know. But wow, that's truly interesting. Let's go back to the prisoners of war for just a moment. You used to go and get prisoners of war to help to work on the farm.
Right.
How did that work out? Did they seem to be good workers?
Most all of them were, and like I sometimes said, they were just as good. Some of them were a lot smarter than me or my contemporaries, because we were young, but they had been experienced agriculturists in the old country. And you got to remember that all my ancestors came to this country either to get away from debts or because they couldn't make a go of it over there in the other country. So they were, to me, they were the cream of the crop, but actually they were the bottom of the crop in that old country. So, but one day, I know there was a big German, we called him Blondie, and our pump down there went up at noon. We didn't have any water. My grandfather and I had always been used to using a jack on the pump, jack it up about 4 feet, and then put a vise on it, and then jack it up another 4 feet.
Sure.
And this guy, he saw us start, and he said, just shook his hands like that, get out of the way. And he grabbed a hold of it with one hand, and he loosened up the jack, and then he hand over hand, he lifted the whole 60 feet of the pipe and the pump right straight up through the opening in the top of the pump house. And when he got it up all the way, he said, tighten it up. Or he didn't say tighten. He might have said tighten it up, but he went like that.
Yeah.
I tightened it up.
Tell him about the one that left.
That's amazing.
Was late being called in.
Well, we during the war, my father was a supervisor at Congoyum, so he got the contract to farm their farm, and we had it planted in sweet corn. So for a week or 10 days, we had the maximum number of German prisoners we could get to help pull sweet corn. And the only time that we didn't need a guard because we had the same ones every day. They didn't bother sending anybody. So this one day we had one young fella with us, and when it was 3 o'clock or 3:30, it was time for me to come home to milk, and I had to bring the prisoners home with me. And my mother would take them up to the camp then. So they had to be trustworthy. I mean, my mother taking 5 German prisoners of war, 12 miles,
Right.
and this one little guy was missing. But just as we got loaded and got situated, he come running up over the hill, and he could speak a little broken English, so he was sitting in the front of the truck with me, and he said he wasn't trying to get away or anything like that. He wanted to see how the paper machines worked. So he walked across the north branch of the Tapsco River. It was only about 2 feet high, and he went in the mill and he looked around. And when he got satisfied how they made the paper, he left, and he almost. But he said he was gonna walk home. He was gonna walk over here if he couldn't catch us on the truck.
Right. But he wasn't trying to get away. He
No,
just wanted
no.
to learn.
He just wanted to see what it was like.
Yeah. So this was the Congolium mill?
Congolium Narron Company, yeah.
Right. And what were they doing over there?
They made, and as far as I know, still do, they make felt base for Congolium Narron Rogues.
Mm-hmm. And they were doing it then, and they were doing it now. I guess they
Yeah.
probably did it for the war effort at that time.
They were probably making some, well, they had them, during the war, they had a machine shop.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody that was deferred from military service could get so many points. If they wished to be deferred, they could get so many points for working in a machine shop.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that's kind of easy to understand, and not too many people know about it. But when I went to high school, two of the teachers in the high school, male teachers, Fred Ingalls, and somebody else, I forget who it was, Alfred Myers, I think, they were school teachers, but they were also employees of the machine shop at Congolium Narron.
Mm-hmm.
And during the summer, and so many hours a week, all year long, they worked in that machine shop.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, my father was a shift supervisor right there, so he was they were well acquainted with him, and he was well acquainted with them. So everybody worked together. I mean, nowadays, if your high school teacher worked for your father part of the time during the week, it would be highly strange.
Right.
But they
That was for the war effort.
But they worked for the war effort.
Mm-hmm. Now, these prisoners of war, eventually, after the war was over, they sent them on back to Germany.
They all went back to Germany.
Okay.
And they were mustered out.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether they got any remuneration in Germany or not, but they did here. They got paid $3 a day. And that wasn't bad money then.
That's not bad money. And think about it. They were actually prisoners of war that were brought over here.
Got paid.
It was an expense to bring them over, an expense to take care of it, an expense to send them back. They were treated pretty good, weren't they?
Yeah, and they treated us good too.
Yeah. So it sounds like the German citizens that ended up over here got along with
They were not Nazis.
Yeah,
they were not
no.
Nazis.
They were just regular people.
Just regular
They got
people.
pulled into the war.
Yeah.
And were there relationships made between the people here and the people
Yes. The Rosenberger family up the road here, and the Bollinger family, they had German roots, so they understood German, and they talked to the German prisoners, and they're probably responsible for having put together a good crew, and we benefited from that because my father's oldest sister had married John Rosenberger, so she told him which prisoners to get.
Sure.
But after the war, the Rosenbergers visited Germany. And some of the older Braunings went over to Germany and traced their roots to the villages where my father always wanted to go and visit these guys that worked for us. He did correspond with them.
Right.
He wrote in English.
Yeah.
And they wrote back in English, but they had an interpreter over there. And
so they stayed in contact after the war.
Yeah.
Some people actually went over and visited.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's amazing.
He has an interesting story about one of his relatives. Tell about the one that came over in the flour barrel.
Oh, the like I said before, some of our ancestors' doings were kind of shady. When my father's great-grandfather came to this country, from whom all of we Braunings are descended, he was 9 years old, and he had two older brothers who had booked passage from a German port to Baltimore. They couldn't get three. They had a younger brother who wanted to come. So they put him in a flour barrel on the deck at night, the night before the day of sailing. And they didn't let him out till after they got beyond the 50-mile zone.
Right.
And then they couldn't return.
Right.
So he was a fugitive. Actually, our ancestry descended from a fugitive for justice.
Yeah.
The name was Browning. At that time was B-R-O-E umlaut N-I-N-G. When they got to Chesapeake Bay, they heard news that the mayor of Baltimore City was named Browning, B-R-O-E-N-I-N-G, without the umlaut. So when it came their turn to report at the customs house, they had to declare the other boy, but they took the name of the mayor.
Right.
And I guess somebody in the customs house assumed that there was probably some kind of a relationship there. So they let the boy in. They didn't really detain them. They all three landed.
Yeah.
The two older fellows went out to the far west and settled. But this young boy, he stayed here in the east. And he and his clan settled down here near Louisville. And that's where we came from.
Ended up in Carroll County.
But we're all, actually, when you go back far enough, some people can go back to Charlemagne the King. We go back to Louis Browning, the fugitive.
That's true.
What an interesting story. He was a stowaway in a flour barrel.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. What a great story. Well, Mr. Browning, you ended up with how many? You've been in the dairy business, it seems like forever. You got started in the 30s?
Got started in about 36.
And what was the most number of cows that you had here at this dairy farm?
Well, Martha, when my father quit dairy farming, we milked about 35 cows with milking machines.
Right.
And then Martha and I took over, and we milked about 40 for 25, 30 years, I don't know. And then my son took over, and he started out with the same number, of course, the same herd. And he had only increased it. He never increased it over about 10 cows. We never got big like a lot of people.
Right.
And now, his son,
Gary Brauning III.
Gary Brauning III, is the honcho, and his dad works with him, of course. But they only increased the size of the herd maybe 5 or 6 or 7, 8 cows, something like that, because that boy went to Virginia Tech, and he's interested in show cattle and improved dairy records.
Sure.
So they do their own breeding, and they show cattle, and they compete in show rings, all over the state, and some other places too. We had a nucleus of show cattle because my brother Dave showed cattle when he was old enough to, and did very well. And this Gary III, he does very well. They do use embryos and all that kind of stuff.
Different from us.
So, Mr. Browning, you've had this dairy farm's been in operation for 3 generations now.
Yes.
On its 3rd generation.
Yep.
And about how many cows do they have now?
They milk about 45.
About 45.
But they have about 35 young stock. And that's what we got up. They utilize both of our buildings for young stock. Heifers, bred heifers at one barn and open heifers at the other.
I don't think people realize how labor intensive raising cows, running a dairy farm is. It's 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You have to milk in the morning, and you have to milk in the evening, and then you have to do work all the rest of the day and night.
Right.
I used to always say, we could get babysitters for the children, but we didn't get babysitters for the cows.
That's right.
Somebody in the family had to be here. We used to give farm tours, and I was in charge of them since I was a school teacher, and Gary would take one group and I'd take another. And I'd say, what do you think we do on Christmas morning? Oh, you open your toys and you do this. I said, no, the men would go to the barn and milk, and the children would have to stay in their room till they come back from milking, and then we'd open our presents, but we milked the cows Christmas morning and Christmas evening. Oh, no, they couldn't get over that.
Well, you come around one morning and be a half an hour late for milking. The cows will let you know, won't they?
That's right.
It's time for them to be
right.
milked.
Yeah, if you'd miss one milking, you'd mess up your whole operation for months and months.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell him that story about where the little kids were climbing on the fence,
Oh.
but don't swear.
Yeah, I swear a lot. Actually, I had work harder not to swear than most people realize. But we had these farm tours, and Martha would take a bunch back to these barns, and I'd take a bunch with the school teachers and their parents down that way. We had a board fence all the way along that lane there. It was getting a little old in the last couple of years, and these little kids would run over and climb up on it, and I was afraid they'd break a board down and maybe hurt themselves.
Sure.
So they kept doing that about halfway down the lane, and this teacher, she kept hollering to this one kid, and I winked at her, and I said, you can't, but I can. And I told him, I said, boy, you get on that fence one more time, I'm going to put this shoe in your behind so hard you're going to go clean over the fence. And he looked at me. The teacher says, you can't talk like that. I said, I talk like that, and watch that boy. He got down from the fence. He walked over on the other side of the road. He walked right straight down the road and never touched the fence, and neither did anybody else.
That's what he needed to
That's
hear.
what he needed.
Yeah.
That's what he needed.
And that's what kids need to hear a little
That's-
bit more
that's
often.
right.
And with knowing that there's authority behind it.
Right?
to
That'll
follow
do
through.
it.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, the teacher says you can't do that. I said, if that boy gets on the fence, you watch and see.
Wow. Mr. Brownie, let me ask you a question. We, in Carroll County for the last 10 years or so, have been moving toward setting aside land for agricultural preservation. And I know you've been a farmer all your life. Your dad was a farmer. Your children and your grandchildren are farmers. How do you feel about the agricultural preservation program? What do you think about that?
I think it's kept a lot, maybe not a lot, but maybe about 25 farmers on the farm. To help them buy machinery and modernize their operations. But when you can't make a profit on the farm or anywhere else, the inclination is to leave that operation, leave that vocation. And I see that in my lifetime, land values have tripled and quadrupled, and they're just so high now that land's the best thing in the world in this area that you can own. And I can't see hog nosing and hog tying your offspring into a position where they don't own the land outright. They can't do anything with it but farm it. Now that's all right for the consumer, for the land that is in ag preservation, because it has resulted in a very few large farmers or farm collectives that can really farm and really have the equipment.
Right.
And about 4 or 5 of them farm the whole county now, up and down the road. They're good farmers. They use good seed. They use good machinery. Do a good job. But if I put these farms, we have about 300 acres now. If we'd have put that land in ag preservation, my boys and their offspring would be limited to what usage they could get out of the farm.
Right.
Well, the farm up on the crossroads there, for instance, Meta Acres, that was owned by my father's sister and her husband, and it passed down to their children, and their children died out, and it went to their offspring, who were a boy and a girl, lived in Baltimore City. They were adults.
Mm-hmm.
They sold that farm for $2 million, and it was about 70 acres. But if it had been in ag land preservation, they wouldn't have been able to sell it at all.
Right.
And this farm here, my father developed. We split the land. My father and my brother Horace Jr. and I. He actually almost gave it to us, but we split it 3 ways. My father developed his on both ends, and my brother developed his. But I've never developed any, because I want to go to the children that are farming, and if they can't make a living out of farming, they can sell it for whatever the price for lots are.
Right.
They won't have to sell it for agriculture. And I that's the way to go. I think I don't agree with agriculture preservation from the farmer's standpoint.
Right.
If the agreements would be that genuine descendants from the original owners would have option somewhere down the line, if it was 20 years or 25 years, but to have obstruction on the farm deed in perpetuity,
Right.
in my way of thinking, is wrong. And I don't care whether anybody agrees with me or not, but if a farmer sells the right to be the truthful owner of a piece of property so that he can keep going, he's having public subsidize him in the present, and he has no gain possibility in the future.
Right. Now, Mrs. Browning, you mentioned earlier that you were involved in 4-H. And I know, Mr. Browning, you were involved in 4-H. There's a really strong 4-H component in this county. So there's a real strong effort for agriculture. As a matter of fact, in every county there's a county fair. But in Carroll County, they still call it the 4-H fair, and it has a very strong 4-H component. It's all about agriculture. Showing your livestock, putting up your canning, showing your arts and crafts, but very strong. It's very focused on 4-H and agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about 4-H and how you feel about that? I mean, it's made a big difference in your life, I imagine.
I've always been in 4-H, and our whole family has. We were probably as involved as it was possible to be involved, because we went through the 4-H clubs, and I was local leader for a long while.
I was too.
And so was Martha. And then we went in senior council, and I don't like, it's not proper to say blah blah blah. I was this and I was that, but we were in senior council, and we helped organize the 4-H fair at Taneytown after the public quit having the fair there. Hubert and all, and a couple Flickinger boys, and a couple Bullingers from up around Taneytown, and the Colders from down around Sykesville, and a couple of us Braunings. We in Stuart Young, we resurrected the 4-H fair in Taneytown. Then we got permission from the owners of Big Pipe Creek Park. We had it up there a couple of years, and then Charlie Brim, Solomon Hoke, Stuart Young, and I, at Mr. Burns' insistence and help, we went to the county commissioners one day, and my mother had a first cousin who was a commissioner then, And Stuart Young's father was a commissioner, so we had an inside deal with the commissioners. And us 4 guys went over there, and we worked a deal that for $1 a year we could operate 1/3 of the county farm as a 4-H fair for Carroll County. So that's how it got started, and the different clubs in the county built whatever they could. They'd build a barn or contribute to the central hall or something like that, and it grew and grew and grew, and till now it's county-wide, and they got, in my opinion, they've got awful well-qualified directors and operators, but they've taken on all the dredges that come along with a big fair. They built that big building with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and they're having a little trouble paying it off now, but they'll get it paid off.
Oh, eventually they will.
Yeah.
But it keeps a wonderful tradition alive.
It keeps a good fair.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Because the 4-H keeps agriculture alive, teaches children values, and
It's a wonderful. It's the biggest thing in Carroll County. No matter what anybody says.
yeah, it's a great program.
One organization that we've been involved with was with Farm Beer, the young group, and that we all had little children, and we all had farm. What do you call them? Groups, farm beer groups, discussion groups, and we met for years and years. And they had the state picnic at
Rocks
in the
Park.
Rocks in Harford County, and so there were quite a few of us that belonged to this group, Associated Young People, and we we were all having babies then. And we always said it stood, "Are you pregnant?" It stood for "Are you pregnant?" But we went to Harford County, and Hilda Miller and myself organized the thing. We took all of our own food. We had 10 or 12 families went, and I don't know how many children. I mean, it was just an innumerable number. And they brought their tomatoes from home. They brought sweet corn from home. And Hilda and I would go to the grocery store, and we'd buy just the essentials. But every family, somebody made spaghetti, and when we organized a menu, a work crew. Everybody that went, they had to work. They had to help prepare the food. They had to help clean up. They had bunks for the men and for the women, the boys and the girls. And we did that for 5 or 6 years, and that was the only vacation that our children had.
No kidding.
Now, the men would stay home. Some of them had somebody to cover for them.
Right.
But lots of times Gary didn't get to go because he was milking.
Sure. Yeah.
But some of the men got to go, and we had memories. We even had a reunion.
No kidding.
About 10 years ago of all the people that had gone.
No kidding.
But we thought it was terrible. We spent $100 when we went to the grocery store, and that was a huge grocery bill.
That's a lot of money.
But everybody brought produce from home.
Sure.
Everybody took turns cooking, and we had games. We played Farmer. They sang Farmer in the Dell, and we had all kinds of games that we organized, but we planned it all ourselves. It cost, I think each family paid $10 for a family. I think it cost $100, and they didn't care how many we brought.
Sure.
But that was one of our main, and people still talk about it. As a matter of fact, one couple met each other there when they were just in like 8th or 9th grade, and they wound up marrying each other, and they're still married today.
Fantastic.
So.
That's amazing. What a great story. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Browning, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day-to-day. I always conclude these interviews with, you've been around for a good long while. You've seen a lot of changes in the county. What are the most profound changes that you think you've seen in the county? And Mrs. Browning, why don't I start with you first? What's the biggest change in the county that you've
Well,
seen?
of course, the traffic, and I think A lot of people think that the schools should teach the children how to handle their money, how to do this and how to do that. And I think that when we were growing up, you were taught how to take care of your money, how to take care of your room, and all those things. It wasn't somebody else's job to do it.
Right.
And of course, with the increased traffic, it's harder now to farm and have your machinery on the road.
That's true.
But we manage. We have pretty understanding neighbors here,
Sure.
and they don't mind when we have to haul out manure because we only do it very seldom, and it only lasts for one day.
Yeah. You have to do what you have to do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's part of farming.
But
My
I
wife
think
doesn't
Gary was
understand
adding more to the changes than I did.
that. How about you, Mr. Browning? What changes have you seen since you were a youngster in Carroll County?
Well, I think almost everything you do today is easier because of modern equipment and tools and fruition of ideas. It's easier to milk 50 cows today than it was 10 cows when I was first starting. And it's more enjoyable to ride in a car today than it was to ride a bicycle or walk to the store or to church when I was a child. And you have a lot more consumer goods available than we ever had. There's still methods of procuring your own food and fiber, but it's so easy and so handy to acquire it by just going to the mall or going to the store. Some of the flavors and specifics of food and fiber have changed in order to have a longer shelf life and appeal to more people. But those instances are far outweighed by the ease of procurement and education. There are so many fields of endeavor today that people can go into that didn't exist when we were young. You didn't need them much either. Today the emphasis is on entrepreneurship, and if somebody can think of an idea where it would add to entertainment or add to lifespan or day-to-day enjoyment, no matter what it would be, that'd be the thing to get into, and that's the way we keep things going. And I think sometimes we overdo our concern with personal entertainment or some other forms of living that we'd be better off without. We'd be better off without a lot of drugs. We'd be better off without handguns. I don't see where handguns. I'm a hunter, and I know a little bit about guns and have about 6 or 8. But I don't see where handguns are necessary at all, except for a bona fide police officer.
Correct.
Or the armed services. This thing of having a gun in your under your shirt or on your hip, to me, that's a sign of cowardice. I don't like it at all. If you could still have a gun. If you got to have a gun, have a long gun, and people can see it. And at least they got to raise it up to aim at you. And if you suspect that, duck or run or something.
Sure.
But you.
Well, Mr. Browning, you raise a very valid point. As a farmer, when you grew up on a farm, you kept firearms. You did it as a matter of course. You were a hunter. You supplemented the food that you got on the table with
Still do.
Yeah.
Rabbits. He's a rabbit hunter.
Sure. From the woods, from the fields, you would supplement. I mean, it's no different than a person going to the creek and fishing.
Right.
You put fish on the table, you put rabbits and squirrel on the table, or venison on the table,
Yep.
because it was available. It's part of what you did. And you used a rifle or a shotgun to do that. You also had a gun around to protect yourself. You never knew when a stray dog might come in the yard that might have rabies. It was important to have a firearm because it was protection, but it was also help to supplement your food on the table. So I understand exactly what you're talking about.
And when we went to school, almost every boy had a knife in his shoe or on his leg, and then they never pulled it out. It was just there.
But you know, people don't realize that in the old days, every man at least would carry a pocket knife.
Right.
You had to have a pocket knife because it was a tool. It was an implement that you
still
used.
is for me.
Still is. You use it every day.
Yep.
For hundreds of different things.
That's right.
And it was an indispensable tool. No man would walk around without having a knife on his person, so that he could, it was protection, but it was also a tool that you used every day.
That's right.
Yeah.
I remember our youngest son gave me a pen knife one year for Christmas.
Sure.
Because I was cutting strings on the bales and I needed it in the barn, and he knew that.
And you use it every day.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Now, so there's been a lot of changes in the county. I always like to also close our interviews with what advice would you give to a youngster coming up today? I mean, you've talked about a lot of things today, and the one thing that comes through to me loud and clear is that, we take for granted all the things that farmers do for us every day. I mean, you mentioned going to the mall and going to the grocery store and just buying anything you want. We don't even think about it. We don't think about the value that farming brings to us and the ease, the hard work that goes into farming. But that hard work makes it easier for everybody else in this country to have the food on their table, and we take that for granted. So, but what advice would you give to a youngster coming up today? Mr. Brownie, why don't you start?
Well, I think probably the most important thing that a young person could acquire without having to buy it would be to learn all he can from his father and mother, and any of his living relatives, especially his grandparents. You can learn an awful lot from your parents, especially when they're successful. And if they're unsuccessful, you learn just the opposite. You learn what not to do.
Exactly.
And among the things that I think we're a little short on is the ability to save and the ability to invest. A lot of farmers wind up broke, so they have to sell the farm in their old age so they can remain alive and not a burden. Well, as you go along down through the years, if you invest in some kind of stock or some kind of an enterprise off the farm that would return an interest to you, that's a smart thing to do. And you can learn from your parents and your neighbors or anybody else in the community that's successful what to invest in. But if you spend all your money and more than you make, you might have trouble sometime or other. You might not, but you probably will. And if you invest in something that's paid off for your parents or paid off for your neighbors or somebody that you know real well, that's a good potential income source when you're old. And another thing I think young people should consider the social welfare of their neighbors, their community, and their country as much as possible. If you got one sick person for whom treatment is denied because they don't have the money to pay for it, you got a problem. If you got one person that would like a job and he doesn't have a job, but he's a good worker and he would like to have a job, and he's denied the right to earn a living, well, there's a good chance they'll turn to crime or some other source. So I think a lot of the tenets of Christian teaching are important, very important.
That's very good advice. Yes. How about you, Mrs. Browning?
Well, I think if you could just instill in the children education, I mean, you have to, it's like somebody said, you have to be smart to be a farmer, and that's for sure, you do.
Absolutely.
But there just aren't these easy jobs to pick up nowadays. And I think, it behooves us to help them use their education, their money wisely. Just like Gary said. You save for a rainy day.
Absolutely.
You might think you're never going to have one, but on the farm you have dry spells just like we're having now.
You bet.
And you need some reserve to fall back on.
That's right. So you always should set aside as something, a little something from everything that you make.
Right.
For savings. And what do you think about borrowing? What do you think about credit? How do you feel about that?
Oh, my father was a banker, and Gary's father was a banker.
Yeah.
So we had that drilled into us. You only borrow what you can pay back.
There you go.
Of course, he'll tell you he's never borrowed anything, right?
Right.
From the bank. But his father did help him,
Sure.
too. And I had help from my family.
So your advice is only borrow when you absolutely have to, and when you do, pay back your debts. Yeah.
Pay it back as soon as you can.
Yeah. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Browning, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day-to-day to do this interview. It was wonderful, and I'm hoping that many people will watch this video and will learn from it, will take what you've said to heart, and will value the treasure of your stories, because they are wonderful stories. And I've learned so much today. One of the things we didn't talk about, and before we leave, I'd like to just touch on it a little bit, is when I spoke to you the other day, you mentioned that you don't live very far from the Liberty Dam Reservoir, and you used to remember there used to be a mill where the reservoir is now, Oakland Mills. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about that before we leave?
That's Gary. He knows more about that than I do.
That was one of the most efficient avenues for off-farm employment. They employed a couple hundred people, and they had enough looms in the mill that in the wintertime, when a lot of farmers had little or nothing to do, they could gain temporary employment there, and it was a very important industrial complex in this part of the county. During my early years, there wasn't a family around that someone from that family didn't have temporary or permanent employment at the Oakland Mills. And when Baltimore City bought the land for the reservoir, they bought the shoreline on both sides, 1 mile distant from the expected high water mark.
Right.
And that included the whole town of Oakland, which had been a company-owned outfit, and the man or the family that owned it were from New York City and Connecticut. And they had a deal with Baltimore City that they got one payment for the present value of the town, which I don't know how much it was. But then they sold everything before they shut the gates on the dam.
Mm-hmm.
They sold everything, all the houses,
Mm-hmm.
all the buildings, all the looms, everything else in Oakland Mills
Right.
over a 2-day period
Mm-hmm.
for the high bidder.
Mm-hmm.
And it displaced maybe 20 or 25 families,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't have much trouble being situated around. Most of them went to Baltimore City, but
Right.
but some of those families relocated in the county.
Mm-hmm.
They everything went, I thought, real cheap, but I went to the sale because I had an idea of buying several of the company houses and tearing them down and bringing them home here
Mm-hmm.
and building a feed mill.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got there and looked at the houses and decided how much trouble it would be to tear them down and then haul them up here and then rebuild them,
Sure.
I'd had all short lumber,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't bid on them. But like some people did that I know, Harry Kohler from over on Route 126, he bought 2 houses,
Mm-hmm.
and he and his brother tore them down. They took them home and they bought some other lumber too, but they built a 2-story hog house,
Mm-hmm.
and they raised a lot of hogs for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But they're the only successful purchasers of Oakland Mills residue that I know of.
Yeah.
They had, it was an industry that had little usage to the average community because you had to have ability with looms
Mm-hmm.
and wool
Mm-hmm.
and other fabric, and nobody had that. So
Right.
we had Congoleum there and making paper felt,
Mm-hmm.
and we had the distilleries making whiskey
Mm-hmm.
and alcohol, and we had canneries, but we didn't have any other area in the whole county that had looms.
Mm-hmm.
We had a sewing factory in Westminster, but that was little sewing machines where 1 or 2 women
Mm-hmm.
would sew garments. It was just something that had outlived its time anyway.
So they took the whole town of Oakland Mills and basically, I guess, what didn't get sold, they just bulldozed it down?
Some people bought and paid for what
Mm-hmm.
they never moved,
Mm-hmm.
and a couple of days before they shut the floodgates,
Mm-hmm.
they took bulldozers in there and they dug a hole,
Mm-hmm.
and anything that would be undesirable in the water,
Right.
they dug a hole and they covered it up
Mm-hmm.
with rubble.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that like a stone wall,
Mm-hmm.
that wouldn't hurt the quality of the water, they let stand. So
Sure.
if the reservoir dries up, you can go back and see the ghost of the town,
I bet.
the same as you can see the ghost of the bridges in different roads that were inundated by
Right.
the flood.
Sure. There's places where the road goes down to the
Yeah.
reservoir, and you know it has to continue on, but it's underwater.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
So that town is now underwater.
yep.
Yeah.
And the only thing there is a couple walls and a couple chimneys.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember when that happened approximately?
It happened when I was a freshman in high school. So that would have been 6 is 14 is be 41, about 45, 46, long in there.
So as we were coming out of World War II.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yep. Because I remember my father's brother, Charles, we call him Dick.
Mm-hmm.
He was a crew chief who planted all these pine trees around,
Mm-hmm.
and he called them his hillbillies. He had about 15 men
Right.
that moved up here from North Carolina and West
Mm-hmm.
Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
They were all awfully good with lumber,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where he got his lumbermen at.
Yeah.
They were good men,
Mm-hmm.
and most of those people, I only remember one family and their name was Talbert, and they worked until they got everything finished, along with the reservoir,
Right.
and then they lived on a farm up Deer Park Road here, and they became truckers and other things after that.
So he got the contract to do the planting of the trees around the reservoir.
He worked for the city. He was a supervisor, but
Okay.
and he wanted people that didn't mind working and know something about trees and know something about forestry.
Right.
That was a rough job.
Oh, I guarantee.
You go look at, from an aerial viewpoint, all these trees that are planted from water line 1 mile out. A lot of places, you got steep hills, you got deep gullies, you got
Absolutely.
everything else.
Yeah.
But it's got pine trees everywhere,
Yeah.
and
They did a good job.
they're about 8 feet apart.
Yeah. It took them a long time, I'll bet you.
Yep.
Yeah. 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
Well, again, Mr. and Mrs. Browning, thank you so very much for taking the time today. It was wonderful talking to you, and I truly enjoyed it.
Enjoyed
Well,
talking to
we've
you.
enjoyed talking to you too.